Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Tonic Accord podcast. The past few weeks have seen a lot of protests because of the death and murder of George Floyd. This story has dominated not only U.S. news, but around the globe, as we've seen protests arise in Europe, South Africa, Australia in response. So now on the Tonic Accord, we want to kind of dive into it. What are these protests about? What is happening? What have been the various responses by different nations and governments? And we have a very special guest to offer her perspective today, Leah Thomas, an intersectional environmentalist and eco-communicator. And we're very glad to have her on board. And we're going to dive right into it. All right, yeah. Leah, how are you doing?
I'm okay. It's going. Lots of emotions, but I'm doing okay.
Sure, sure. Yeah, it is certainly been a crazy couple weeks. I mean, let alone a crazy year in general. But to get us started, can you just kind of tell us about yourself, some of the work you've done in the past, and kind of your story?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri, and I've always just really loved nature and being in nature. So I knew that I wanted to do something sciencey, and I really wanted to go to California. So I went to Chapman University in Orange County, and originally I was studying biology, but something just wasn't fully connecting for me. So I went back home and over that summer, it was the summer of 2014, I was thinking about what I wanted my major to be, possibly communications, but then I saw the environmental science and policy program and I decided to change my major. So 2 weeks before I was about to go go back to school, unfortunately, Ferguson happened. There was a police officer involved shooting of an unarmed Black teenager, Michael Brown, that happened 10 minutes from my house. So that was incredibly traumatizing and just made me really come to terms with my identity as a Black person in the United States. It was really confusing. And then I just had to go back to school, which was really difficult because while I was studying environmental science and policy and learning about the Clean Air and Clean Water Act, my friends and family back home were getting tear gassed for trying to peacefully protest. So it just felt really ironic to me that I was learning about different policies that were supposed to ensure the safety and access to a clean environment to everyone. And I realized that a lot of people, like the people back home, that wasn't the case if they were drowning in tear gas. And beyond that, I just started finding out a lot more about environmental injustices that were happening primarily in people of color communities. So I just really narrowed in on environmental justice throughout school. I started freelance writing throughout school and I did 2 internships with the National Park Service. After school, I decided to start my own blog, Green Girl Leah, and I worked in the communications team at Ecos, which is an eco-friendly soap company. And about a year later, I got a job at Patagonia, the sustainable apparel clothing company, and I worked with them for about 2 years. And in recent weeks, there's been similar uprisings to the ones that I've experienced in Ferguson, but on a much, much larger scale. And I've been furloughed from Patagonia, so I started to become really, really active on my Instagram profile and made a call to action to all environmentalists to support the Black Lives Matter movement and try to do my very best to explain why social justice and environmentalism are actually very deeply connected. And I came up with the term intersectional environmentalism and posted it in a post that has since gone somewhat viral. And that is where I'm at now. And I'm just trying my best to take it day by day.
So you touched on it a little bit with your story, but for those that maybe don't really know words like an intersectional environmentalism, what would that like? What would your definition of that be?
Yeah, so I got the word intersectional and intersectionality from intersectional feminism. So when I was in college, there was a lot, I think the first women's marches were happening. And when I was in those spaces, while I cared a lot about feminism as a whole, it just seemed like race was such a tricky topic in those primarily white feminist circles. And it was hard to say, like, yes, I completely understand this, but there's also other things as a Black woman that I face, or there are other things that, you know, Mexican women face and that Indigenous women face. So, and I felt like that was silenced in a lot of feminist circles, and I just wasn't understanding why I wasn't eager to participate in these kind of mainstream feminist movements. And that's when I found the term intersectional feminism, which is a type of feminism that acknowledges the intersections of wealth and race and inequality and how that ties into being a woman and all of that. So I resonated with intersectional feminism because it didn't push those things away. It brought those things to the forefront, and it just felt like a more understanding environment and the only type of feminist environment that I wanted to participate in, because it went a couple steps deeper, and it could say,
Right.
okay, while white women are paid, I don't remember the exact statistic, but maybe let's just say 80 cents to every man's dollar, a black woman is paid even less. Mexican women are paid even less. Indigenous women are paid even less. And I think it's important to talk about those inequalities, not to shame anyone, but to be able to have reference points to treat people properly, like, just to address those things and not ignore them. So that's where I just realized if I want my feminism to be intersectional, then I want my environmentalism to be intersectional as well. So I have worked in primarily environmentalist organizations. So whether that's a nonprofit or in the corporate sustainability space, like with Ecos and Patagonia. So companies that are pro environment and usually donate some of their proceeds and funds directly to environmental organizations. And I wasn't seeing a lot of people that looked like me in those spaces. And I had a similar reaction when I would talk about race and the way that, Black and brown communities were also faced sometimes with poor air quality, poor water quality, cases like Flint, when people are literally drinking lead water. That's something that I can't even imagine happening in Orange County. I just started to realize how wealth and race and all of those things also are deeply interconnected with the people who face environmental injustices. So I created the term intersectional environmentalist, which means, or environmentalism. That is a term that just, it's a type of environmentalism that also factors in the different intersections of race and class and gender and how those things, um, I guess, factor into environmental inequality.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, I took a read on your article on the good trade before we
Yeah.
sat down to talk with you today, and there was one quote I just wrote down because I thought it was really interesting. You said, as my textbooks encouraged me to protect public lands so they could be preserved and enjoyed, I couldn't help but wonder, but for whom? And I think that's a really cool, like, not cool, but very interesting thing to say. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
and so my question to you is, because I think a lot of people think of Flint when they think of this situation, because that was the
Mm-hmm.
one that was covered mainly all over the media
Yeah.
waves. But how common are situations like Flint in the United States?
They're incredibly common. And even if you're looking at primarily white communities, but low income white communities, if you think about mountain communities that have fracking fluid in their water, they've been fighting for years and years and years. And there are still a lot of like mountain towns that have terrible access to water, but it's just not reported on as much. Or maybe it'll make a splash in the media for a couple weeks and then it'll go away. And yeah, this is happening a lot. And a lot of times it has to do with air quality. Like in LA, there are a lot of like Latino communities that are unfortunately experiencing higher cases of asthma that have been directly linked to living in environments of unhealthy air pollution. And there's also rural communities across America of white, low income, and then also Black and brown communities that are experiencing terrible, terrible air quality and pollution, which is leading to increased cases of asthma and respiratory diseases, which is particularly concerning because we're in the midst of a pandemic that's attacking
Uh-huh.
people's respiratory systems.
Right.
Right.
So it's happening so often. And as a park ranger, that's why I think about public lands a lot. Like I worked at two national parks that kind of had a connection to my heritage. So Nicodemus National Historic Site is the smallest national park in rural Kansas, and it's the first town that was built by freed African Americans during the Reconstruction era west of the Mississippi, and it's the only remaining town. So that meant a lot to me. And I also worked at the White House Visitor Center during the last year of Obama's
Wow.
administration, which was amazing to be able to be so close to the White House and kind of hang out with Secret Service and also be there when there was the first Black president. So I was able to see through a National Park Service lens, okay, the parks are here for me too. And it seems like a lot of the people who, sorry, my cat is meowing, but it seems like there's a lot of people who might not think that, oh, Black people don't go to the parks, or it's a primarily like white thing in parentheses. But me being able to realize, no, the parks, my heritage is wrapped in this too, and these lands should be protected for biodiversity, of course, and also so people like me can also enjoy and heal in nature.
Wow.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, I always encourage, I encourage people as much as I can to get out to the national park system, and
Definitely.
we need to protect our public lands, and then yeah, you're right. It shouldn't just be for the stereotypical white Portland, Oregon couple that has, you know, whatever. It should be for everybody, and so I'm all for that. I'm all for that. Speaking of your recent messaging, right? You mentioned how you posted this environmentalists for Black Lives Matter post, and I think in one of the
Yeah.
videos I watched, you had even mentioned that you were scared about the response at first, but then it turned out to be a great response. Tell us a little bit about that and how maybe social media plays into these movements that are going on currently.
Definitely. I was really shocked. I made the graphic in like maybe 10, 15 minutes and just put it together. I was literally in bed under my covers, like in a little blanket fort, because I was just so upset with everything that was going on in the world. And I was mad because I had been going to so many climate protests this year and last year alongside my fellow white environmentalists and, Patagonia employees. And in many ways, I was risking my life even more standing beside them because at times it feels like some environmentalists like kind of glamorize the idea of being arrested in the name of environmentalism. But I started thinking, if I'm arrested, I could be Sandra Bland, like I could die. So I'm risking my life doubly by going to these environmental protests. But then when it came to Black Lives Matter, for years, it seems like there was always silence from a lot of the environmental community. So I made that post because I wanted to, it seems like a lot of environmentalists are good, forward thinking people that are generally speaking pretty progressive and want the world to be a better place, but they wanted to talk about these things, but they didn't know how it fit in the context of environmentalism. So when I made the definition, which is like a cool thing you can do when you make stuff, like I just was like, this is what it is. So this is a form of environmentalism that I practice. And I just wanted to give that resource to the community so they could make that connection too. And so they could act. And I was really just pleasantly surprised to see that people were just waiting for someone to tell them like, hey, you can be a part of this movement and here's why you should be. So to see it take off in that way was really, really awesome. And yeah, social media is such a powerful tool when it comes to activism.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
go
think
ahead, go
it's
ahead,
kind of
Alex.
interesting, just because. So I'm from a pretty rural mountain town in Northern California,
Mm.
and I was seeing friends posting on social media your post about intersectional environmentalism, and and I'm just going, wow, that is so cool to see, because you're like, I think this kind of goes back to your intersection, like you being an intersectional feminist, and then kind of
Mhm.
eventually leading into this is it's such an intelligent way to try to relay the message to people during these tough times is just because maybe you're not impacted by one of these things, there's so much more
Mhm.
to it. And I think that's really cool. I'm just curious on that. Why do you think intersectionality has kind of a negative side to it, especially on the right? Because I have a lot of conservative friends, and it always has such a negative connotation when it's brought up.
I don't know. I feel like that sounds like a personal problem, to be completely honest. I think some people get afraid of acknowledging the way that race plays a role. And maybe when you talk about privilege, because no one wants to think that they've been maybe benefiting from a system that's oppressing other people. So it's better to just get angry, deny, and block it out. But it's just interesting in conversations about privilege, even as a Black woman, if someone's like, "What, Leah, what privileges have you had in your life?" I could say, both of my parents went to college. So statistically speaking, I had better resources available and an expectation to be able to go to college and guidance. That's a privilege that I've had in my life. I've gone to really great organizations like for school and for schooling. That is a privilege that I've had. I've grown up in a middle class household and background. I understand that privilege in being in a two-parent household. And I can talk about all of those things, and I'm not beating myself up over the fact that that's how I grew up and that was the situation that was handed to me, but I acknowledge it. So if someone is like, it was a little bit harder for me to go to college because I'm a first generation student, I'm not going to turn around to them and be like, well, that's your fault. It's not my fault that my parent, like, that's just not a nice, compassionate response. But when it comes to race, it seems like there's so much pushback. There's so much pushback, particularly with that one thing that becomes very defensive. And I don't know, maybe both of you can talk about why that might be the case or how that might feel, because I know those conversations can be very difficult to have, but I've just experienced so much pushback, especially from the right, but at times also in liberal circles. And I think people think that when privilege is brought to the table, we're talking about it in a way to shame people. And maybe some people do, but that's not the approach that I'm taking. I just want to be able to acknowledge it so we can move forward. And honestly, I think these different civil rights movements keep happening because it's not being acknowledged. Like in other places, when there's genocide, like in Germany, it is illegal to wear certain Nazi memorabilia or have certain statues. But in the United States, that's not the case when it comes to slavery or the injustices that have happened to Indigenous people. So I think there just needs to be a very strong, like, this is wrong, an acknowledgement of it being wrong as a society. And it seems like that's what's happening to finally fix this. And maybe it's not going to be perfect, but there has to be acknowledgement. And I feel like the denial in a lot of ways is contributing to a lot of violence because people aren't able to get over their own ego. And that's contributing to the deaths of so many people.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add one more because I think that's a really nice answer there, and I think the problem is because I consider myself a conservative, a very moderate conservative by all means.
Yeah.
And I talk with a lot of my friends, and I think the reason why terms like identity politics and intersectionality have such a negative connotation to them is because what you said, that I think that because we've almost suppressed a conversation that probably needed to be had a long time ago,
Exactly.
that I think a lot of people, even if they don't know, people don't want to hear bad things. People want to block out things they don't want to hear. And I like, do you think we've addressed anything since, the Civil War into the Reconstruction, or have we just kind of pushed it off? Yeah.
I think we push it off. And it's funny because a lot of conservatives, or even more like conservative leaning liberals or moderates, will bring Martin Luther King Jr. into the situation now as an example of like, this is the activism that I want to see. I just feel like people aren't doing activism correctly. If only they could be like Martin Luther King Jr. And it's like, you guys are not addressing the big elephant in the room. Like, people killed this man.
Yeah.
They murdered him. So we're trying to be as positive as possible. This man was murdered. And it seems like people are not acknowledging the very violent history of even peaceful activism. And they're bringing him back into this conversation as a way to shame people who are trying to be activists now and are trying to protest. And it seems like people are almost rewriting history and picking and choosing. And it seems like some people really, and maybe this is just the way that we've approached history, but they think, oh, Martin Luther King happened. Okay, cool. Then we moved along and everything was perfect. It was like Martin Luther King Jr. was here. He was assassinated, as well as, Malcolm X was violently assassinated. And then maybe a couple of things changed for a little while because these people died, but not a lot was solved. Some great progress happened, or a lot of people think, oh, Obama was president. We've moved past. We're in a post-racial society. No, so we can't use these figures. I mean, yes, they do represent progress in a lot of ways, but that doesn't mean the work ends there. So I think there's just there's a lack of acknowledgement, and I honestly believe like the more we acknowledge this, the more there will be unity across party lines when it comes to talking about racial issues and things like that. Because I don't think that talking about social justice is or should be a liberal issue. I don't think talking about climate change should be a political liberal issue. And I think the more that we talk about these things, we can all come together to fight against them and acknowledge them. So then we can move forward and we can talk about other things that are a lot more important.
I think what you mentioned about, like, your post, right, environmentalists for Black Lives Matter, trying to bring together two movements to be, allies, letting people know it's okay to talk about these issues. I think that's really important because, for me, who is a white man who comes from some privilege, I remember growing up, I heard the phrase a lot that if we just stop talking about racism, it will go away. I heard that on Fox News. I heard that from the people at my church. I was raised that way, and I believed that for a while. And it took me people like yourself and others that were willing to have the conversation to offer that welcoming into the conversation instead of an antagonistic approach that allowed me to actually, like, reflect and realize that, I had been taught basically a lie. And so I think that's really powerful. And I think today, back to, the current events, I think we're seeing the largest amount of, I don't know how to say it, allyship.
Yeah, there's a lot of white people outside.
Yeah,
that's what you're
there
trying
are.
to say.
yes, and
It's awesome.
and it's great, all right, and I think that on top of that, I think social media has a lot to do with that. I think the fact that things are filmed more, right, we're more exposed to these injustices, right, and I saw one of the signs at one of these protests was how many have gone unfilmed, especially before people were carrying around smartphones. I think now a lot more people are exposed to these problems, are exposed to different ideas, and social media has a good part in that. And I think the conversation is being had more so than ever, which is great. It doesn't mean that it's going to just solve everything overnight. I'm not arguing that, but I just mean that, like, that idea of trying to bring people into the conversation without shaming them is super important, because I know that that is what led to myself actually changing my worldview a little bit.
And I think people just need to understand, like, if you look back to the civil rights movement and what messages resonated with the majority. So I think people sometimes don't give accurate definitions of what Malcolm X stood for, but I think they were both very much needed during the civil rights movement, because Martin Luther King Jr. had a very great way of winning over the hearts and souls of white people. And some Black people back in the day did not like that messaging. They were like, I'm fed up with being beaten in the streets, and I want to be able to also have the right to bear arms and protect myself. And that's something that a lot of white Americans, they have a very similar ideology when it comes to being able to be armed and whatnot. And I think there were a lot of Black people during that time that maybe resonated with another message that was more similar to Malcolm X, which wasn't necessarily a message of violence, but was one of, you know what, I've been so hurt and I don't want to coddle anyone and I just want to protect my family. So I think now it's understanding that there are going to be different messengers that different people are attracted to. I think there are a lot of Black people that have so much pain and they're angry, and that anger comes from a place of immense sadness. So I think they might be attracted to a message that's a little more, Malcolm X like, and I can't blame them. We've seen so much Black death. But there are also people who might want to hear a different message, and maybe those are other people of color who are not Black, or other white people who aren't at that point of outrage yet that a lot of Black people are experiencing, but they are outraged and they're looking for a message that's a little bit more compassionate. And I don't think most people like being shamed, so that's not the approach that I want to come with. So maybe that's why the message that I'm spreading is a little bit more approachable, because I do want it to be inclusive and I do want to extend that olive branch to people who have been wanting to join this movement but don't know how. But then I also recognize that there is space for people who their messaging might be not the way that I would message about these things, but I understand where that anger is coming from.
Yeah, and that brings me to something that's kind of been on my mind with this, because I think that was really well put. Is that, I think a lot of people, myself included, and probably most of my friends, learned about MLK, and how he
Mhm.
was, and I think a lot of people just picture him and his more peaceful form of protest, and they say, well,
Yeah.
why can't you do that as well? And you're right. There's a lot of different sides to how people have dealt with this, and
Mhm.
I clearly don't understand, but I would like to, and I think it's interesting. And but like what I've seen on social media, I guess over the last like weeks, is
Mhm.
that I think on this podcast what we talk about a lot is how issues aren't always just one or the other, and like more than one thing can be true at once. And
Exactly.
like someone like me, I'm very concerned that sometimes the looting itself could detract from the message of the protests. And I have
Mhm.
people tell me, well, you don't, I guess you don't care about the actual protests. And it's like, no, I
Yeah.
think they have a right to protest and do it, but I shouldn't be
Mhm.
shamed because I'm also worried about the other side of it, the
Yeah.
businesses and the economy.
Mhm. I guess, yeah, and I think you're making really valid points, but when you think about the civil rights movement, like hindsight is always 2020. So
Sure.
when you
Right.
think about Martin Luther King Jr. and you think about what's the first thing that comes to your mind, because there's also a lot of looting that happened back then. And that's what I want to challenge people to think about, because when you're 50 years out or however far along out, when you look back at it, I don't really see a lot of textbooks that are like where looting is a major part of it, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
because it isn't necessarily like happening the most. If anything, I don't have any percentages, but it seems like during anything there will always be opportunistic people
Yes.
who, especially when it's such a big movement, and there's going to be people doing dumb stuff. So for example, like Patagonia, the Patagonia Santa Monica store was robbed by surfers that came in and
Jesus.
stole surfboards. So these
Jesus.
people had no connection to Black Lives Matter movement. They got nice wavy blonde hair, and they stole a bunch of surfboards. And I could focus on that, and give my energy to that. But part of me is just like, okay, these are just opportunistic people that are doing this that have nothing to do with the people who are actually protesting. And when the majority of people are protesting peacefully, I want to give my focus to that, I guess.
Right.
Um, and I think when people are responding to you in the way that they do, I hope that they're communicating. I don't think it's fair to say, like, oh, well, you don't care about people if you focus on looting. I just think that's when it's the primary concern. And it's not like,
Mm-hmm.
hey, people are dying. They have a reason to be upset. Let's address all of these other things first. Like, I think that's why people might be like turned off when people bring up the looting. But of course, I think destroying property is like terrible. And especially if it's like a Black owned business and you're
Right.
fighting for Black lives, it's like, come on, like, let's do this. But to me, buildings can always be rebuilt. Patagonia has incredible insurance. Those surfers, thankfully, they were caught on camera and some of them returned the surfboards. Um, but that's just not as important to me. Like, I just want to give more attention to Black lives. And it also, I forget the statistic, I believe it was over 60% of Americans did not agree with Martin Luther King Jr.'s form of protest, and that includes African Americans. A lot of people
Wow.
did not agree with him walking up and down the street and then
Right.
walking across bridges, and people hated the bus boycotts and they hated the diner sit-ins,
Right.
and those things were viewed negatively by the majority of America. So again, hindsight 2020. So that just brings the question, what is the right way to protest? Because it's hard to answer, because sometimes, and I think when I'm talking to some conservatives, when they say, well, this just isn't the right way to do it, and I push back and say, what is? It
Yeah.
seems like the answer is
Mm-hmm.
something that doesn't disrupt their day. They don't want to see it. They don't want to see it on social media. They don't want to see it when they're walking down the street, and they say, well, I think that you should just go through the legal system. And you can see clearly why people are not going through the legal
Right.
system. So if the answer to what is the right way to protest is, I want you to protest in a way where you don't impact my day and I don't see you and I don't have to hear your messaging and that you're not destroying things, like, then I
Not
think
not
that
in front
that's
of
an
my
issue.
football game, not in front of my basketball
Yeah.
game. Yeah.
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 I do think that, like, and For back to the idea of like, property destruction, I actually do give credence to those that are destroying Confederate statues. I think that's fair game. I mean, first of all, like you
Yeah.
said, Target is insured, Patagonia is insured, they'll be fine. The families of George Floyd are not insured, quote unquote, in this sense, right? So,
Yeah.
but I see the destruction of Confederate monuments as completely justified. We even talked
That I understand, yeah.
we even talked about on this podcast a couple of weeks ago about violent revolutions in other parts of the world, and how I made the claim that when you have a complete breakdown of that social contract, right? When you believe that, hey, like, we give up some freedoms for the idea of living in a just society, if that social
Yeah.
contract is broken, it lends credence to these actions. And I think that
Exactly.
I think that in this case, I mean, it's very obvious that the social contract was broken between George Floyd and the police officers, and for many, many others, Breonna Taylor and more. And so when I see the destruction of Confederate monuments, especially since even Robert E. Lee himself said, "Don't put up statues of me," I think that is justified. I do understand how some people might get upset about looting, but you're right that I often find, and I'm not. This is not directed at you at all, Alex. This is actually more people I've seen on Facebook.
No worries, go for it.
Yeah, people on Facebook. It's an excuse to then ignore the problem. I've seen it. I've seen some people post, like, even like Ben Shapiro, like, how is this at all honoring George Floyd? And it's like, well,
I hate that.
yeah, but it's like, yeah, but like, how are you honoring George Floyd? I mean, or Donald Trump talking about how George Floyd's looking down at the jobs report. Like, just it's such a twisted, manipulative way to then excuse yourself from the issue, I think.
And I also, just to chime in, like, who do they think that we learned this from? I don't know. Maybe American history and the revolutions that often were violent,
Right.
or the revolutions that also came with the destruction of property. I don't know. Tea,
Yes.
Boston Tea Party. So it seems like it's okay to glamorize revolution when it's white people revolting against another white system. But when it's Black people or people of color, and at this point, there's also a ton of white people that are also, like, getting harassed in the streets right now, like, revolution is only reserved for a particular group of people, or protest, even angry, somewhat violent protests when people don't want to wear a mask. It's okay for them, but revolution isn't given to us. And that's something that I find troubling, because the American dream is built on revolution. So shouldn't we be able to participate in creating a revolution to make America truly a better place, and not just a Donald Trump slogan? And I think people forget that people are revolting because we are not upholding the ideologies of what America is supposed to be. And we want our country to be the place that it promised. And then we want to break down any systems that are not honoring that and treating people equally.
Yeah, what really concerned me, actually, I think it was last week or maybe a week and a half ago, was the other case between Christian Cooper and the other lady named Cooper. I forget her first name. Who were in New York.
Cooper.
Yes, that's right. That one, to me, in a weird way, and I'm not trying to detract from what happened with Floyd, but to me, this one actually disturbed me more for some reason, just because it was a liberal white woman who had been a donor to the Democratic Party, would consider herself probably progressive and, like, on the side of this movement. And she literally knew that she could threaten calling the police because she knew of her advantage in society. And that really disturbed me, actually.
Yeah.
It did to me as well. And I think it's important that it was caught on camera of her doing it in the act, because a lot of times, like, Black people will say something happens and people are like, oh, you're exaggerating. No one does that. And to catch it on camera and for it to be a liberal white woman, that's why I was saying, like, sometimes I don't feel safe in white feminist circles, because that same white feminist woman could turn around and accuse my dad of harassment because he asked her to put her dog on a leash. And some of those same white liberal feminists that voted for Obama but secretly wished that it was Hillary, maybe, I don't know, could turn around and make me feel super uncomfortable or potentially threaten my life. So that's why I think it's, and in my opinion, in many ways, liberal racism or implicit bias is even more impactful, because those are the circles that I'm in. And it was important to have it on camera, because it was finally like a gotcha moment of us being able to be like, you guys know what you're doing. you know exactly what you're doing when you call the police. You know exactly what you're doing when you say that you feel quote unquote threatened by someone's presence. And to be able to see it, I think it was validating for a lot of Black people in America, and also something that a lot of white people in America could be like, oh shit, what can I do to make sure that I don't do this, or my friends don't do this, or to be able to validate that this truly is happening.
I think that's why a lot of conservatives, feel almost like the left is hypocritical sometimes, because they're told so many times by a lot of white liberals that, oh, you guys are all racist if you voted for Trump, which, I mean, I'm sure there's a percentage that are, but not everyone. And I think there's a bit of hypocrisy where a lot of conservatives, for that reason, say, well, you kind of shame us, but then at the end that video shows that, everyone's about the same on that. And I don't like that. I don't know.
I think it's important. I think one of the professors at Chapman that I had that is one of my favorites is Dr. Paul Apodaca, who is one of the best at the Chapman, I believe. And he mentioned that it's like racism is not like something where it's like, oh, you're either racist or you're not racist, and then it's not something that just ends. It's like he said, it's like mowing the grass. You have to have a continual awareness and activism to try and combat prejudice and racism around the world, because I mean, people use differences in culture or appearance as excuses for prejudice all over the world. And no one is free from that. No one is like, well, I've ascended above that. I am prejudice free. Everyone has to constantly work on and acknowledge that. That was something that for me that, I had to struggle with, because I had that same idea, right? I was raised in a family where it's like, well, if you're not part of the KKK, then you're not racist. You're fine, and that's not the reality, as we've seen. I want to start shifting. For the little time we have left, I want to shift on the next step, right? So we've seen 2 weeks of protests. The 4 officers involved in George Floyd's murder are in custody and being charged. The main one is Chauvin, Derek, I believe, Chauvin. He is charged with second-degree manslaughter and now second-degree murder. The other 3 are charged with aiding and abetting in that. We've also seen Mayor Garcetti of Los Angeles say that he's going to have major budget changes to the LAPD, because the LAPD is the vast majority of the LA city budget. He wants to change that and reinvest that into minority communities. The mayor Cuomo of New York has also mentioned that he wants to make some changes to the NYPD. So, Leah, I want to ask you, what is the next step? What are some of actual on the ground changes that you want to see as a result of these protests?
Yeah, I think something that's really incredible is how you said people are reallocating funds to minority communities, and hopefully they'll go directly to education, because education in a lot of ways, I think, help decrease crime and gives people something to feel really passionate about. So I'm really excited to hear that. And I think also, I really just think that I don't think the police shouldn't exist at all. I think that's kind of silly, but I think that there needs to be some really serious training that goes beyond just very simple, boring, implicit bias training. I think that more people in the police force need to be people from within a particular community, because I feel like that will provide some kind of balance and understanding of what that community is, going through. Because at times, I forget if it's the Stanford or Princeton, but the prison experiment, I don't know if y'all are familiar with that.
Stanford and prison experiment.
Yeah. Like if you give people a little bit of power and tell them that they're a little bit above someone else, it could be their friend and they will beat the shit out of them. So I think there needs to be some really serious training, and also bringing in people from the community, so we can avoid that us versus them thing that I think is happening with a lot of police officers. And sometimes I think people struggle to see themselves in other people of a different race. And I've seen this happen at Chapman. I was an RA, and at one point there was a drug bust where there was a white fraternity student that had I'm not even kidding you, pounds of cocaine in his room. And I remember the way the police talked to this boy. It was just it blew my mind that they were so kind, and they were like, oh, we've all been there. And I'm like, we haven't.
No.
We haven't been there, sir. And I'm like, Black people have been killed for less things. But I watched in that moment this white man connect with a white boy that reminded him of himself. And to be able to essentially, I mean, they can write a slip that says you're arrested. I don't know if you knew that. Like, they don't have to take you in. They can basically just give you a document that says, like, you've been arrested and, like, show up here. And for that to play out for an actual, like, maybe, I'm just going to say drug trafficker, because that was so much weed, like, not even weed, but like weed and cocaine and like pills and everything, to see that play out in that way, just because this police officer could see himself in that boy. I think we need to bring on, like, build trust and maybe make being a police officer seem like something that's honorable in one of these communities. So if they could set up a program that's like a training program, a community-based policing program where they're bringing people from the community into these positions of authority, I think that will build trust in the community with the police and also vice versa. And I think these cases of violence will go down. And I also think crime rates will go down if they also increase funding to education. So those are just a few things that I would love to see happen.
I think those are all really fair points, and yeah, you know, it's something that I could never understand, because I mean, I've never had giant bags of cocaine at my house that I'm selling, but I have had, you know, one or two interactions with the police in my life, and I've never felt like my life could be threatened, and that is a problem, and it's something that I think is just unacceptable. You know, but what I do have to ask you is, would I be wrong to think that there could be other elements to this as well? Like talking about just kind of the brotherhood in the police department of kind of protecting your own, and that there's no accountability, because clearly that with the George Floyd murder, and none of those police stood up to it, because at least my opinion is they knew that nothing was going to happen. And this comes again and again, you know, and they were not three white guys, which I don't think really matters. But the point is they knew that nothing would happen, because it never does. And also, I think I saw that 2 of the 3 guys had about a week of experience on the streets combined. Like, that mixture of factors is just disturbing to me. And like, I think the problem is that like a lot of people now, especially with these protests, especially in Minneapolis, I saw that people just want to dismantle the police department, and that's not the right. I think like the right thing to do, in my opinion, is we need to change it and systematically improve it. But we need to realize that maybe there's more factors than just one. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think there's definitely various factors to this. I think the brotherhood of policehood is one of the really strong ones, and they haven't faced any consequences, so why would they care? And I think we've given the police so many opportunities, from hosing people down during the civil rights movement and sticking dogs on them, and seeing, okay, well, how have we improved? So back then, in the 60s, the police officers decided to use water hoses and dogs on people and also kill them. Okay, cool. So I guess we must have improved, right? Because we're in 2020. Okay, so now instead of just water hoses and dogs, they now have military grade equipment, and they are using military grade equipment on civilians. So I'm just trying to see what improvements have really been made. And I feel like we've given them so much time to make improvements. So at this point, I don't want to dismantle them altogether, but I think there needs to be some really intense internal change that is not led internally, because that brotherhood is so strong. So I don't know, like, if they were able to even create a new police system just from the ground up, I know that's not going to happen, but one that just has different training from the get-go and is attracting different kind of people from the get-go, then I think things would get better. But at this point, I don't know what trainings would actually be effective, because if they've had this much time and they've only escalated the way that they handle civil rights movements, like, that's scary to me. And I don't know what needs to change, because I know those implicit bias trainings that I have to do at work. Nobody likes those. Those are so boring. They're so boring.
Yeah.
So I think there has to be something that's done that holds people accountable, and they need to shake up the police system as soon as possible. And in my opinion, demilitarize the police, because there's no reason that there should be like tanks rolling around. And in Ferguson, they were like tank-like vehicles rolling around. And it seems like why would anyone trust you if you seem like you were at war with civilians who are trying to peacefully practice, most of them peacefully demonstrate? And if we could make the police seem like a positive force for all, I think so much would change, and would change really quickly if people could just trust that the police will be held accountable. So I don't know what has to happen, but there needs to be some serious changes that are super close to dismantling,
I think
in my opinion, to see actual change.
I think a big one is the qualified immunity clause. The qualified immunity is a legal doctrine in the United States federal law that shields government officials from being sued for discretionary actions performed within their official capacity, unless their actions are violated clearly established federal law. The problem with that, though, is who investigates the police is the police. And until you put enough pressure to then make it to the FBI, which has happened in this case, but again, only through public pressure. But this qualified immunity basically says you can't be sued for discretionary actions performed within your official capacity, which means that it's a valid legal defense to be like, well, I was just following orders. We've seen that now many times was, hey, I can't be sued for this. I was following orders, even though it's completely unethical what I've done. So that qualified immunity, I think, has to be eliminated. I don't see why we even put that in the first place. I think that's just one of many changes that needs to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. And just going a little bit further into that, just before we're out of here, I just wanted to say, so does it make you nervous? Like, I guess it's to both of you a little bit, that one poll I was reading said that 58% of Americans supported Trump sending in the National Guard.
That's concerning to me, definitely.
Yeah. I mean, if anything, how is that going to help people? Like, is he trying to start a war? I'm just curious. Like, if you're going to treat people as though they're enemies, like, I don't think this is going to solve anything. It's just going to make it worse, and more people are going to die. Like, I think more and more people are going to die, and that's what scares me. And I think a lot of the people that are going to die are people who are peacefully protesting. Yeah, and it's scary because it's like they are creating a revolution because they don't want to just hold police officers accountable. Like, this could be solved so quickly if we just were like, you know what, we're just gonna hold these people accountable, and we're gonna just address these things. And if they actually did that, but instead they would rather go to war with their own country, and that's something that's concerning to me, because people will die, and I'm just not ready for that type of bloodshed that's going to happen during a pandemic. So I don't think he's handling this properly, but it's not just him. I don't think these things have been handled properly since before the first civil rights movement. So I think there's just a lot that's been done wrong, and I don't want him to poke the bear of the situation, and I think it's just going to get more out of hand.
He's certainly poking the bear, and he's certainly trying to trying to use it for his own election gains, which is
Exactly.
Unfortunately no surprise at this point.
The world's pretty I mean, here in Madrid, everyone I've talked to is pretty disgusted. The Spanish people are going, how the hell is this happening? And I'm just worried that Trump's response, along with just the response of law enforcement in general during these protests, I think the world is going, well, the U.S. sends a message of protest and free speech and democracy, but boy, they're sure bashing that right now.
Yeah, we tell the people in Hong Kong, go for it, but then we tell our own people, no, stay at home.
Yeah. And then arresting journalists, like, sorry, I have to run in like about a minute, but arresting journalists, to me as a writer, it's like, are you kidding me?
Yeah, that's
you guys are trying to stop people from reporting what you're doing. Like, that is not. That's
what Vladimir Putin does.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, we covered a lot. I know you have to run. So Leah, thank you again so much for being on this podcast. We really appreciate you coming on and sharing your story and your voice. For those listening, definitely check out greengirlleah.com. It's great stuff. And please stay tuned for the future podcasts. Thank you again for listening.
Thank you. Bye, y'all.